Into my heart an air that kills, from yon far country blows. What are those blue remembered hills? What spires, what farms are those? That is the land of lost content, I see it shining plain. The happy highways where I went, and cannot come again. Good health to you and welcome to episode 3 of the Fire and Hammer podcast, a general Q&A on the Order and other topics. I am Gothi Charlie and I'm here with Gothi Richard. Hello Richard.
Hello.
Richard's visiting us from up north, which is lovely. He's come down south to come and spend a week, see the sights, catch up on some tobacconist shops and have some general fun. So how have you been doing?
I have been surviving. I have been managing to adapt to your southern ways of life down here in the far southern reaches beyond the cold north.
Yes, we did have a point made to us in the week that anyone from down south thinks that the north's past London, and anyone in the north thinks that the south is basically below their own city. So,
I mean, not wrong. It's quite true.
Yeah. I'm probably not completely wrong now. Right. So yeah, this podcast is generally going to be on the topic of the Order, in terms of our basic structure. I'm aware that a lot of people we've spoke to haven't had much context towards what the Order is. Obviously, we are a Telegram channel. We do obviously run blots, as I'm sure many of you have seen. But we have a lot of work going on behind the scenes, and we have a general mission towards England. So we wanted to really sum up what we've been working on in these last few years, and hopefully give a bit more perspective on that. So I'll start off with the topic of the Order itself in terms of our general structure, and then I'll go on to basically a bit about our mission statement. So off the top, our general structure is a holy guild and order. By that we mean it's a symbiosis between an order, that being a religious fraternity of brothers within a structure, coinciding with a holy guild, basically, that being holy labour in the name of our gods. Of that basic structure, we have 5 ranks, going from neophyte all the way up to master, and the paths which we follow, there's 5-fold. Each one is essentially a different vocation in the traditional context of the word. That's our basic structure down to hand. In terms of what we want to do as a mission statement for England, we hope that the faith can explore a lot more outside of just our very niche esoteric circles. The faith is in and of itself quite exoteric in the sense that we do build into the folk community quite a lot. We want more people to come in as worshippers, and really, as Gothi especially, we want to make sure that we are a part of that society, which should lead quite neatly on to your conversation about friary.
Yes, so one key thing that I like to emphasise whenever I'm discussing the wider Germanic and Anglo-Saxon faith, the wider traditions that we follow as a group, as an order, is what we are trying to achieve in the sense of it being a friary. There's the difference between a monastic group and what can be compared to something like a medieval friary. So a monastic group is very much separate from the outside world. It's this idea of a separate society, an enclosed society that is its own self-sustaining item and not part of the wider community around it. However, a friary is still a monastic community in a sense. However, they are fundamentally linked to the world around them, to a community. You'll see ruins of medieval friaries on the edges of old medieval towns. They're on the edges of the community. They're still on the periphery. They still have a degree of isolation. However, they still partake in wider events around the community. They still are active in towns, active in communities, and so on. It's that we're more trying to go for, where it's today in the world around us, it's important to then still be interacting with other people. It has to be interacting with other communities, with non-believing communities as well. It's that idea that we're going for. It's not so much the concept that we're trying to exclude ourselves and be entirely insular. That is just a way to perpetuate our own self-death as a community, as a wider folk-believing community. So having that idea of a friary is very much key to our own sustenance, to our own survival, to our own future going forward as part of the wide Anglo-Saxon Germanic faith community.
Absolutely. And that point about self-death is also quite poignant. Obviously, it is very important to follow these kind of values for our folk community. When the order first started, as a bit of context, the order was slanted more towards being a monastic order. Naturally, as a lot of obviously young, quite zealous pagan men come up in this age of ruin, we do become a lot more pious than possibly what prior generations of the average men would be. Because of that, we do try to lean towards more insular groups in terms of our faith evolution. The point of maturity, I find, towards obviously us as a priesthood especially, is understanding, as Richard was saying, about this basic folk building, the idea of going out more into the community and trying to do good. So Richard, how would you see the pagan priesthood going out in this model of a friary? How would it look like for the future?
So future, it comes under multiple objects in that sense. It comes out not only proselytising and widening the faith community of our own belief in that way, but it's also increasing general awareness, it's increasing other people's education in their own history, in their own faith, their own traditional beliefs, and gaining the respect, if anything, of not only believers of our own faith, but also non-believers and other peoples as well. It's being active in that sense. It's being not just content to stay within our own walls, it's being proactive. It's being determined to actually make an effect on the world around us, and importantly, maintain what is sacred within that world. Like, as you know, one of the key things that I sort of very much advocate is maintenance of the sacred sites and holy sites. I've done quite a lot of cataloguing of various sacred sites, holy sites, places of importance for the Anglo-Saxon Germanic heathen community around England in particular.
Yeah, absolutely, my hometown.
Yeah.
Richard is quite vocal in terms of trying to map out a lot of our more obscure sites of worship, and particularly just sites of interest that may have been lost to the folk at one point as basically being sacred. Really, the model of the sacred society comes down to our input into it. As Richard's noted, the priesthood need to have this quite positive outlook towards how we build the folk up. While the more monastic model may work for a lot of Christian organisations, it wouldn't necessarily work for us as well, and it's actually quite ahistorical. Pagan priests have always been very involved in their host societies and not separate from them. The advent of such arguably could have come with Christianity. So in terms of this, obviously, model for society going forward, would you give any advice specifically towards young men who want to pick up the torch of being a Gothar? This podcast itself is about the Gothar as a whole, so I'm curious from your perspective as a Gothi.
For those wanting to pick up that torch, like I would give the example of, for myself, where I was in quite rural northern England, it was a case of pure necessity. It was a case that there wasn't anyone around me that was going to do it for me. It was pure pragmatism as well. No one else is going to do it, so I will. So at that point, if someone else is considering it, look around you. Look at what is going on. Look at your options in terms of local communities, local groups that might already be operating, and think, okay, what can I do? What can I bring? Is there someone already operating in that space, in that area? If so, can I talk to them? Can I see what I can do around them? Then help with their being tutelaged by them, being brought under that umbrella. Certainly ourselves, we have members quite widely across the country at this point. But in the cases that there isn't, okay, what is out there where I can learn? Is have that desire to learn, have that lust for knowledge, because fundamentally, if it isn't taken on and learned by other people coming into the faith itself, that knowledge will eventually end up being lost, which will be the greatest loss of all. Absolutely, that knowledge is only partially written down. Lots of it is still surviving in folk traditions, in oral traditions. It needs to be gathered together. It needs to be continued. We need to keep that continuation going. in a sense. So look around you, evaluate your surroundings, is what I'd say to people.
And it's that loss of that initiated priestly lineage that has caused us to get to a point where, even though we are blessed to have as much lore as we have for our hierology, we are lost somewhat in terms of some of the more specific information that we may have preserved if it hadn't been for particular forces in society. As part of that, obviously, progression towards the growth of the priesthood, I echo what Richard has said in that the priesthood, as its construction comes about, if you're able to support Gothi in your local area, please do so. It's very important to make sure that our priests do get the attention and support they deserve. If you have no Gothar around you and you feel that you're someone who could step up to the plate for that, there's not any setback in terms of you doing so. That's the key element. We've been doing this for many, many years as of this point, but still to this day, we are still learning in as far as our capacity as Gothar. And likewise, as you set out on your faith journey to start this path of going into this caste system, you will likewise learn many, many things. We are honestly echoes of the Gothar of the past. I'd imagine you would echo that sentiment likewise.
It's something I often remind people around me of, both who are getting started in the faith and also people who have been present in it for a very long time, that we have to constantly remind ourselves that those of us who are already practicing at the moment in this current time are the ones that in years to come people will look back on and see as founders. We have to live up to that already, as we are currently undertaking rites and ceremonies for then people to look back on in the future. Absolutely. And runestones exist only for the strong and the brave and courageous. With those traits in mind, what we do here as priests in the modern day is fundamental to the growth of our faith for the future. Unfortunately, we don't live in a time of the height of our, obviously, golden lineage as pagans, but we do live in the height of, or really the honour of living in a time of planting the seeds for the future. We don't do these things to get the recognition from our descendants necessarily, but naturally that will come with, obviously, great deeds. There are many, many young people I know especially who pick up the knowledge of our faith, they spread it, they teach, they act as excellent translators, interpreters and educators, but they don't take that natural step into being a priest. In many cases, it's because they don't understand how to get into it. Because naturally, with the end of the initiation line, there's, it does beg the question somewhat about how does one initiate. So I think we'll go on to that topic now, actually, because that's quite a good one. With the path of initiation, what would you say in your mind is the key value or the key way to initiate if you had to boil it down into its basically components? The main thing is drive. Yeah. It's the main thing, although it's been discussed to many great lengths by lots of people, that as we are planting those seeds, there has to be the first generations who will ultimately be the first to initiate themselves, to self-initiate. Obviously, that is somewhat ahistorical, but we have no other option. Historically, people would be initiated by an elder, as someone above them in that sense. But now, as those seeds are being planted, there is the option slowly being more apparent and being more available to other people. So it is getting there, and it will gradually get there as time progresses, of course. But not everyone has the drive to become a priest. That is clear, and that is natural. There is nothing at all wrong with that. But that is the key thing for people who are looking to get into it. It is the case of there is a lot to learn. There is always more to learn, even from ourselves who have been doing this for a long time. It's having the drive to go, okay, what's the constant self-improvement? What's the constant things I can do better? What's the constant things I can learn, importantly?
Absolutely. And I think more so is not everyone has the actual affinity or ability to become a priest. Even though many, many people can spring up to pick up the torch by their own, obviously, metrics and worth, it's very quickly apparent to one if they can actually be a priest or not. I've heard of many cases of people holding block once or twice and then just completely dropping out. Naturally, as Richard says, he's hit the nail on the head with that it is drive. Wisdom is so important towards our faith. Haiwan himself posits on wisdom again and again throughout our Havamal. But It is the drive, the base drive and the base desire to be a priest and to lead a community that will carry us out of the Wolf's Age. I've always said wisdom is the most important factor, but I actually agree with you that I think drive is extremely important. If we have people who are wise and have no drive towards them, then they affect nothing. It doesn't matter how smart you are in a corner. When people come with questions, your mind will be changed. So yeah, absolutely, I think drive is a very key point towards that. For the model of society going forward, naturally we have quite a lot of different groups, Richard, in this country, especially in England, that each push forward for the idea of a priesthood, but naturally we are quite decentralised. Do you see the future of the faith being more on a model of a centralised system or more towards decentralised groups working together?
I feel as the faith grows, there will be more centralisation that comes with it. However, we need to keep mindful of not growing too centralised. We have to grow centralised to an extent for the sake of our own appearance, or our own image, and our own self-policing in a way. But also, we have to remember that there was local cults at the time of our ancestors. There was variations in worship based on geography. There was different hierarchies of the gods. There was different importances placed in that sense, especially in terms of how the lineages of kings were traced, in all over the country, to be honest. So there's a limit to it. We can't say absolutely one or the other. I feel that there will be that link towards centralisation, but it cannot be absolute.
Local tradition is very important in as far as it comes down to our growth of our faith. We can't have an idea, at least in my personal view, of there being a central organisation for the whole of England, or rather even the whole of the world. It's somewhat ahistorical, and it also does destroy a lot of the local traditions and customs that local communities might develop over time, or even pick up as a rediscovery of their ancient past. With a more decentralised model, it allows priests to initiate in various ways and forms and then network together as almost a synthesis of what the best and strongest caste system that comes out of it is able to create. I think we're quite united in the idea that a caste system does need to come back for our priesthood. What's your thoughts?
Certainly, I agree on that concept of the concept of castes is the most effective way to essentially federalise and structure going forwards. If we centralise, then that has its benefits for absolutely certain, but as we have just discussed, but with the dangers of going too centralised, it becomes a case where those local traditions effectively become lost in that sea of centralisation. However, having something that allows for those local traditions to be preserved, continued, and allow for their practice, continued practice, then something that is fundamentally caste-based and fundamentally federalised in a sense, to use something as slightly more of a governmental style, is quite pragmatic, really, going forward.
Absolutely. A few years ago, I actually, to note on that, went to a Jack in the Green procession around May Day in my village where I used to live a few years ago. And they had a few local traditions there that I didn't recognise at the time, but from speaking to a few people there, it became quite apparent that they had existed, a few hundred years prior to now. So absolutely, those local traditions do matter, and if we don't carry them forward into the future, then we do run the risk of our faith becoming more stagnant and a bit more hollow of what it once was. That natural evolution and that organic flourish of culture is so important in the change of our faith and the way things work going into the future. Of York itself, obviously you're from York. I recently have gone on a pilgrimage towards Winchester, another old medieval city. Are there any points of interest around York that you would say are of interest to pagans who are across the country?
Absolutely. So York is very well known for its links to the Danelaw, and there is obviously the locations around there that are very heavily linked. However, some of the key ones that I would absolutely recommend people in the area to visit, or even people just visiting York itself to go in and actually have a look at. So if you're in York, go yourself to the Museum Gardens and go to the Anglian Tower. It is absolutely fantastic and 100% worth seeing. Going down, it's on a small little alleyway, essentially, stuck between a large building on one side and the actual medieval city walls of York on the other side. And going down that small alleyway, it's essentially like a little progression through time in that way. There's the later medieval city walls, there's the slightly earlier medieval city walls, there's the parts of the Roman walls, there's parts of the medieval monasteries and churches that were in that area, including some rather large stone sarcophagi. And then further down, there's the Angling Tower, right at the far end. The largest Anglo-Saxon stone structure that isn't a church, still standing. Isn't a church being a key part
Unfortunately,
there, yes.
we do find a lot of our old buildings are just basically churches.
Yeah.
I mean, when I went to Winchester, where the cathedral was built, it basically where it currently stands, the old minster, which is the actual original Anglo-Saxon construction, is about 3 kilometres to its north. Unfortunately, a lot of our history is preserved via these old buildings. That being said, though, they are the sites of old temples, so absolutely, they are still worth visiting. At least many of them are. Leading from that, you've been doing research into temple sites.
Yes.
Obviously across the country. What have you found thus far? Just as a brief summary, as we know that your essays will be coming out in due course for the Order on this topic.
So, I found essentially a key framework of criteria that can be linked towards various sites that are commonalities across the country, to be honest, about various temple locations. So as we were saying about, I said about Angling Tower and there were places in York there. Just outside of York at Goodmanham, the place that we know Coify travelled to and united a pogrom there to burn down the temple and threw a spear on it whilst riding a horse. The temple there at Goodmanham is, well, now where the village church sits. And that is actually, it's a good example because it sits on top of a large mound in an otherwise very flat area. That is the first key thing. It's on raised ground. Raised ground carries geographical bonuses in that it's a point of prominence. It's a point of, this is a significant place. Naturally, that is an absolute. And then another place, there is water not far away. That is another thing that is a recurring aspect. Places between water and land are always places of significance in the sense of uniting of the realms between water and earth, both in a physical and in a spiritual sense. That's another key point. Another one as well that is in some, but not all. It's not at Goodmanham. It is, however, at Yeavering. There is also the presence of other previous ruins left behind, so whether it be standing stones, whether it be hill forts, whether it be other earlier monumental structures, like Yeavering is a perfect example of that, the Yeavering Old Bell Hill Fort, just above. That is one that's not overly common, but it is common enough to say for lots of sites around the country, almost a majority, but not quite. It is very much present. There is other areas around it. It's the sense that when the Anglo-Saxons were arriving in this country during the folk wandering, they would have seen already that this particular site was something already of significance. It's already marked, if you would.
Quite a good summary there of things that you found. So you would say that one of the most prominent things of these temple finds is the elevation of the land?
Yes, it's a point of prominence. It's something that stands it out amongst the rest of the community, amongst the rest of the landscape as well.
Yeah, which naturally makes quite a lot of sense towards people in the village seeing it as a significant sacred place. We know a lot of our early ancestors had hill forts. Many European cultures had similar things, which were built for the purpose of defence. Having that in the form of a sacred site as well naturally would give quite a lot of prestige to the area, so that makes complete sense. It also marks points that could have been used for possibly more faults, but are instead being used for sacred worship, which again would make sense in the context of our forefathers, as attacking temples would have been absolutely taboo, as shown by Coify's account. I think we'll cover lastly the points around sacred sites around England. Part of his temple research, Richard has been looking, as I've said before, into more obscure sites. What's the favourite site you've dug up so far?
There's been some that have really been up there, to be honest. Some that have been absolutely fantastic. Some have been very much less known. One of my absolute favourites for the pure entertainment value of it. So, not far from my sort of own area up in North Yorkshire, there's the Hall of Horkham. And the local legend surrounding that is, so it is just in sort of like a sort of very foothilly area, and it's, as you come down off of the foothills, there's a great big dip, a great big bowl. On the other side of the bowl, there's a large hill. Yeah. And the local legend is that a giant, in an argument with his wife, took a scoop of earth and threw it at her and just missed. And absolutely just completely missed. And that's what the hill was formed off of. A large just heap of earth in the middle of a domestic argument, and that's it. However, that hill itself has been a point of strategic interest. It's been a point of interest amongst communities. It's been, well, it's had various uses all throughout its own history. But that local legend that surrounds it is really quite entertaining, to be honest. It's just something that makes me smile.
I think men missing is the catalyst for quite a lot of arguments, to be fair, so that does make complete sense. One of my favourite sites I found as part of my research, somewhat of a cliche answer, was Wayland Smithy, which is quite a known site. I didn't know what my expectations were for going there. When I did eventually go there, I found a very lovely little burial mound with an entrance underneath which you can actually explore. If you're quite claustrophobic, I would advise you not to go inside. I'm not so much, but I saw a few people there who were a little bit too shaken once they came out of it, because it is very snug. The old legend goes that it's the site where Wayland, our blacksmith god's smithy, actually stands. And if you are to leave any broken objects outside of the smithy with some coins, come back in the morning and the object is fixed and your coins are gone. I'll end lastly, as the very last point, back on a complete round circle towards our order. With the development of our order, naturally, as I've explained at the start, our structure is following more of your friar model as a way to try to push into the community and help them develop and be spiritual guides for them, rather than try to create a sideline society. What would you say is the most important thing for any organisation that has a similar model to the Order in terms of the drive towards folk building?
So I would say it's twofold. I would say, firstly, modesty. We cannot get too ahead of ourselves. We cannot get too big-headed. We have to remember who we are. We cannot be too far over hills and, oh yes, we're doing fantastically. There will always be ups and downs. We know that. That is absolutely true. And part of that is the whole test of what we are doing. And secondly, the whole idea that by being attached to communities, it will be a struggle. It will be a constant struggle. But it's that perseverance, it's that stoic resistance, it's the continuing to try, continuing to educate people. That key idea there is the other part of what I would say.
And that's the end of our podcast. If you've liked this episode of the Fire and Hammer podcast, please make sure to subscribe on our Substack, as well as follow us on our other platforms. We do this as a labour of love and for the passion of our faith and its growth. Any donations towards our temple fund is more than welcome and is generously accepted. I will leave you with a reading from Havamal 11. A better burden may no man bear, for wanderings wide than wisdom. Worse food for the journey he brings not afield, than an over-drinking of ale.
Thank you for listening.